Okay, so I'm going to take you on an incredibly quick tour through an incredibly long project, which is shaping up to be the empirical input into a bigger project about the theory of the firm, innovation in the theory of the firm. The first empirical part of it is something that Chris Bucafusco, Stefan Bechtold, and I have been doing probably now for about 40 years. It's a series of experiments on sequential innovation. I'm glad to say we're coming to the end. I wanted finally to present it to a bunch of IT scholars so you can tell us the tweaks we can make to make this paper closer to perfection, which it's not ever going to be. It's an experiment. So what are we doing here? We're thinking about borrow, innovate decisions. So how do people make decisions between borrowing from existing creativity around them and innovating, inventing around existing ideas? This is similar conceptually to the make or buy decision at the heart of the theory of the firm. This is how we're trying to expand the literature. There's a few people working in this area. We want to join them. So how do people decide what to do? Borrowing is costly because it requires a license, but innovating is risky because it's hard to know how much of the innovation space remains given the existing creativity that's out there in the world. Okay, so two hypotheses which are utterly commonsensical to anyone in this room. Creators will innovate more as the cost of licensing IP or existing creativity goes up. Creators will innovate less when the size of the innovation space remaining to them that isn't propertized in some way shrinks, right? So those are the hypotheses. I think pretty uncontroversial from a rational choice perspective. Do they in fact hold up in an experimental setting? So we've designed some creativity tasks to try to get at this. The first one that I'm going to tell you about is a wagging task. So we're inspired by the Oregon Trail game. We have subjects loading up a covered wagon. The wagon has a weight limit. If you overload it, the axle breaks. You've got a bunch of stuff you can put in there: guns, dried fruit, elk jerky. These things have a value and they have a weight. So it's a combinatorial optimization problem. The trick is to load the wagon as heavy as you can without breaking the axle and get as much value in there as you can, right? So it's a good task, we think, for our purposes. It's a type of creativity task that tests convergent thinking, but not calculation convergent thinking, because you can't, unless you're a real genius, do this by calculation in the time we give you. It forces you into a frame of heuristic cognition, right? And that's the kind of creativity, for example, that's involved in inventing algorithms for video games, right? It's a cognition that we want to test that we think is creative. The game gives us some benefits for the experimental setting. It allows objective scoring. There's a formula. It's easy to define a property rule. So if you take two elements of someone's solution, that's not borrowing. But if you take three, that is borrowing, right, with different implications. You can change that property around, 1 versus 2, 3 versus 4. It's up to you. And it's easy to measure the available innovation space. So you can actually map out all the possible solutions. If you're presented with a pre-existing solution, you can figure out how much of the innovation space remains. You can figure that out with a great deal of precision. So this is helpful to us. Okay, so how do we construct the setting? We tell subjects that another player has already played, and here's the solution. They've loaded the wagon with these things. We're actually going to present a pre-existing solution, and they're going to decide what to do with it. Will they borrow from it, or will they improve upon? Will they innovate around it? They get 1 point for each step closer they get to the optimal solution. Each percentage of the optimal solution they achieve, they get a point for. We establish a property rule. 2 is innovating, 2 or less, whereas 3 or more is borrowing. And they're paid 50 cents for participating and an additional 3 cents per point scored. Now, the actual upshot of this is they can pretty much triple their take if they do well. So there's a nice little incentive for them to do well. So they're told when they get the game that someone's already done a solution. The items that this person that came before them have selected are bolded in yellow, so they can see very readily, and they just drag and drop things into the wagon. So it's very easy to borrow, or it's very easy to innovate, depending on what they want to do. They are not told, and this is very important, they're not told how good the solution they're presented with is. We don't tell them how much of the innovation space is left. If they have some sense of that, and it turns out that they do, and this is actually really surprising to us, it's implicit, it's tacit. Okay, so their own payment will be based on how many of the items they use, right? If they use more than 2, they'll be borrowing, so they'll get their solution score, right? Their submission score. They'll get whatever percentage of the optimum they achieve in terms of payout. But if they use 2 or fewer items, they're innovating, and then they get a bonus, right? So there's an incentive to engage in innovation here. The incentive depends on the size of the bonus. So what do? We vary the bonus. We randomly assign subjects into one of 6 conditions. The bonus can be +1, or +8, or +16, +32, +58, +72. We calculated that the indifference point, given the difficulty of this problem and the quality of the initial solution, should be between +10 and +20. So what should we see? If you were living in rational choice world, we should see very few people in the +1 condition innovating, because borrowing is clearly the dominant solution here. There is no return to innovating for virtually anybody. In the +72 condition, everyone should be innovating. The bonus is enormously, too large, really. It should just push everyone into innovating. So that's what we would predict. We don't get anything like this, as you'll see in a minute. We run this on Amazon Mechanical Turk. We recruit about 600 subjects, almost 60% of which are male. It's an artifact of Turk. We remove 143 subjects for either failing an attention check, a kind of general attention check, or failing either one of 2 very specific comprehension questions where we're testing their understanding of the bonus scheme here to make sure that they're understanding the math. And then we create a dummy variable for innovate or borrow based on whether they use 2 or fewer items for the given solution. Here's what we get, flat, right? Essentially, we have a marginally significant difference between +1 and everything else, but we have no significant differences really from +8 to +78. This is just bizarre, right? So our subjects seem largely indifferent to the explicit bonus that they're getting to innovate. Now, what's interesting though is we see pretty high rates of innovation. We see crazily high rates of innovation in +1. People like to innovate in this game. Almost 60% innovators, which is crazy because the dominant strategy is borrowing. But also kind of crazy, in +78, where the dominant strategy is just so powerfully innovating, we get about 66% innovation. So, 34% or so of people are borrowing when the math just tells them they should be innovating. So what's going on here? There are a couple possibilities. One is nobody's paying attention, right? We don't think that's right for reasons I'm about to describe. But importantly, we see lost welfare, and this is very interesting to us. If you look at the actual scores achieved, mean scores achieved by people in these different conditions, look what happens in the +1 condition. The innovators score less than the borrowers, right? So there's an advantage to borrowing in +1, actually in how people perform. And the delta between innovating and borrowing is lost welfare. If people made the rational choice, they'd be doing better. So look at +72, right? There's a huge benefit from innovating in +72, as you would expect, because people get a big bonus if they innovate, but lots of people choose to borrow in that space, so that's lost welfare there as well. So we have a mechanism for selecting between innovation and borrowing that's producing a deal of inefficiency. Okay, so maybe people just don't understand this, but we don't think that's right because we did a whole bunch of post-testing, including asking people what their perception was of the difficulty of the underlying problem. We get an incredibly powerful correlation between a subject's perception of the difficulty of the underlying problem and their propensity to innovate. If they think it's easy to innovate, they innovate. If they think it's hard to innovate, they don't innovate. Now, what's weird is that their perceptions are often wrong, but not always. In a minute you'll see that they actually do track reality to some degree, but they are reacting to their internal impressions rather than to external prompts, external prods. And this is odd. They're following their own muse a little bit more than the muse that we try to provide them, the monetary muse. Okay, so we ran the experiment again using a different task, a different type of creativity, divergent creativity. This is based on Scrabble. So we give them a set of letters and we give them another player's words. The letters, of course, have a value, and we say, make words out of this. And you can borrow some words that the previous person did, or you can just innovate on your own, not borrow. Again, it's the 2 versus 3 rule. We sorted them into these bonus conditions, right? A little bit different bonus conditions, but calculated mathematically to produce about the same incentive as the Wagging Task. We recruit 600 subjects on MTurk. We provide them with other players' set of words, which you see here, and we say, go at it. It's the same kind of decision about innovating and borrowing. And look what we get. We get actually something pretty interesting. So in this task, subjects are responsive to the bonus condition. These are a significant indicator of the rate of innovation is bonus size, right? Now, that said, although people are responsive in this task to the bonus condition, they're still not nearly as responsive as you would think, right? So look in the +1 condition, you get about 36% innovating, right? These people shouldn't be innovating at all. It's clearly suboptimal to innovate in the +1 condition. In the +65 condition, this is really weird. You get only about 60% innovation. 40% of people, actually even worse than in the Wagging Task, are choosing to borrow when innovate is the clear, strong signal. So the same kind of rigidity that you see in the Wagging Task, you see here, even when people are responsive to bonus size, which suggests, hey, they are paying attention, there are conditions under which they will be, at least to some significant degree, responsive to bonus size. One other experiment I want to tell you about, go back to Wagging Task. We presented people randomly with one of 3 different initial solutions. One that was 60% of the solution space, a pretty poor one. One that was 80% of the solution space, a pretty good one. And one that was 100% of the solution space, a really good one. And we said, innovate or borrow based on this underlying solution. We offered everyone the same bonus, one that was calculated to make them indifferent between innovation and borrowing. And what did they do? Well, they actually responded, right? So in the 60% solution, the kind of poor solution, we had a higher rate of innovation. In the 100% solution, we had a lower rate of innovation. These are significant differences between 60 and 100, flirting with significant between 60 and 80. The point here is that people, again, are responsive to their internal impressions of the innovation space, the difficulty of innovating, not so responsive to external prods like IP's incentives, which is, in a sense, what we're modeling. So this is weird. This has a whole bunch of potential consequences, which I'm going, well, there are some limitations, obviously. Lay people versus real creators, right? These are people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, not computer programmers or painters. Individual versus firm creativity, these are people making isolated decisions. These are not people embedded in the research department at Pfizer. Much more complicated thing to study, but probably a lot different. Rapid cognition versus lengthy gestation. So we have Pam Sanderson to thank for this observation. These people are being asked to do stuff fast. How do we study people who do stuff slow? That's harder to do in the experimental setting, so keep in mind these limitations. But these limitations, properly considered, we still have, I think, some intriguing findings here. People do not sort themselves into borrow versus innovate decisions based on external prods very powerfully. They do so to some degree in one of our experimental settings. They seem to sort themselves into these categories based on internal impressions of their capacity to innovate. Right? Internal impressions, which I have at least some hopes that psychologists will now turn to understanding and manipulating. Because that's, of course, what we're trying to do. We're trying to manipulate people's incentives with IP. Maybe we should start manipulating them with different, more subtle tools. Okay, so I'm going to stop there so that we have some question time. Yes. We got a line. We start with you.
Okay. Well, so I was just wondering about the quality of their innovation. So you show the points that they got, but that was based on the scaled bonuses that they get for innovating versus not.
Right.
But did they do better in picking the things for the cart than the solutions that you presented with? I mean, obviously they couldn't do better than the 100% of the solution space, but it seems like it's worth knowing if the people who thought, even if they were getting a small bonus, who thought, well, I still want to innovate, if they in fact did better than the existing.
Yes. No, they didn't.
Okay.
Right.
None of them do better?
Well, not on average. I mean, some people do better. And the question is whether they're just better at it or whether they got lucky. But on average, things actually turn out the way the math would suggest. So look at +8, +16. So this straddles the indifference point. Right, the indifference point we said was between 10 and 20. So these two conditions are within the indifference range. And where subjects should be indifferent between borrowing and innovating, given the math of the problem. And look what happens. Actually, that's how it turns out. There's no significant differences in performance between borrowers and innovators in these two conditions. Here, you see this asterisk. This means at a very high level of confidence, there's a significance in difference between the innovator's performance and the borrowers. With the borrowers, the innovators and the borrowers. The borrowers doing better,
But,
right?
but those scores take into account the bonuses they get, right? I'm
Yeah,
just
but
wondering
you
if
can
they
subtract out
solve the
bonuses.
problems.
Yeah, even if
better.
you subtract out the bonuses in all of those conditions, they end up exactly the same, right? So if you do the
Okay.
math and take off 72 and 58 and 32, you'll see those numbers turn out to be exactly flat across the board. It's like
Okay.
startlingly flat, like
Yeah.
frequently flat.
So people basically are about as good as innovating as they are at borrowing, and they're just not responding to incentives, which is like the point of what we do. Which kind of sucks for what we do. Jonathan?
Yeah, so I get maybe this is just an expansion on Pam's rapid cognition point, although maybe not about the behavioral side of things. So I mean, you're asking people to make a pretty difficult sort of benefit calculation that's a sort of meta calculation to a pretty difficult math problem you're asking them to solve, right?
Yes.
And you're asking them to do it in a pretty short span of time. So the person has to sit there and think to themselves, how well am I going to do if I borrow? How well am I going to do if I don't borrow and get the innovation bonus? And I guess it's not, I mean, I would like to, have to know more about the setup of the Scrabble game to see what differences there are, but it's not shocking to me if people are just sort of getting that wrong and making mistakes in that calculation over time. So I guess I wonder, have you thought about just running the same experiment with plenty of more time to think and make those sorts of calculations to see if it really is something about preference for innovation versus preference for borrowing, or if they're just sort of making, if they're trying to do a difficult optimization problem in a short span of time, and they can't think through the meta question effectively
We
enough.
did something a little different than that, which I haven't reported in this talk, which is we ran Wagging again, but we made the bonuses crazy. So we made the top bonus, what was it, 100? Okay, and we saw a significant difference. So if you poke people enough, right, then they do something. But across a range of bonuses in our experiment, which were calculated to be very highly compensatory at the top, we didn't get enough to prod people. So if we gave people unlimited time, what we're worried about is they're going to start calculating, right? Which isn't what we don't want to test math. We want to test creativity. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here with this particular task. And I hear your problem, but we need to design another task to get around.
I guess I would say, just as a quick follow-up, that the thing that's difficult is that when you have short spans of time like that, it's hard to differentiate between sort of use of a heuristic versus rational behavior, or rational behavior where they're getting the numbers calculated right versus attempts at rational behavior that involve mistakes.
So our only check on that, and I think it's a valuable check, but I take your point. Our check is, where is it? It's at the end, it's that, right? So they have enough time in this 90-second span to have some internal impression about the difficulty of the problem. And this is across a large enough pool of subjects where you get the sense that, okay, so they are making judgments about strategy based on difficulty. And that's actually a much harder thing to know than the size of the bonus, which is like something you can rapidly take into account. So this to us is suggestive that it's not that they're not thinking, they are thinking. They're just thinking within an implicit framework rather than this kind of explicit one.
So
Sure.
one story about IPs that you're trying to motivate people to be creative, and others that you're trying to motivate people to invest. And I'm wondering how much traction this stuff gives you on the question of investment decisions. It seems like you can pretty simply give people money to spend, where they're not picturing themselves as the creators. They're just trying to decide, do you want to hire a creator to come up with a new Scrabble word, or do you want to use one of these off-the-shelf Scrabble words or something like that? Is that something that you've tried, or that you
So no, not
would wanna
directly.
try?
I mean, we have an experimental protocol in mind for precisely that question.
Yeah.
We haven't tried it yet. But
Yeah.
we just briefly, what we'd like to do is have a fake graphic design contest, get a bunch of graphic designers to participate in it, give them some tools and say, you can buy more tools to make a
No. I'm talking about somebody who needs a graphic design,
Yeah.
decides whether I'm going to hire a
I'll
creative
get
person.
there in about 10
Okay.
seconds. So we set these people loose and we basically allow them to buy more tools. We see how much they invest.
Yeah.
But then we also have people who hire them,
Yeah.
the advertising agency manager, and we see how their investment decisions are different from the actual people doing the work.
Right.
So this is something we'd like to do. In the future, we haven't launched it yet, but this protocol is not that, Jeremy.
So my main issue with this design is the one that I have before, is the size of the reward, not relative to the reward. The size, not the size of the reward for innovating relative to the size that I get if I don't innovate, if I borrow, but relative to other baselines, right?
Yeah.
So if we talk about prospect theory, not the way patent theorists, but the way behavioral economists talk about prospect theory, how much I already have
Yeah.
matters a lot to how much I want what you're offering. And the same might be true in a similar way with respect to the opportunity costs of investing in this kind of innovation. Right? How much does it cost me based on my baseline of endowments to do the extra innovative work? And that can be heterogeneous across your sample, and the best you could get would be some sort of average of that.
Right.
But those seem to be two complicating factors for determining whether the incentive is actually doing the
See,
work.
you're getting the sense like, okay, so we're offering them 50 cents and they can make up to like $3 and something, right? So basically you're saying that innovation requires extra cognition, and so why invest in that extra cognitive effort for like $2.50 extra? Is that the point?
Well, that's kind of the point, but the
Yeah.
point is not for $2.50 extra, but for $2.50 compared to all the wealth that I've ever had, right? $2.50 is shaped. What $2.50 looks like as an incentive is shaped by the endowments that somebody already has.
Sure.
Somebody on Mechanical Turk has some predictable kind of range of endowments probably, but that may be A, different from the population at large, B, different from, as you said, professional creative classes, and could be
So
heterogeneous.
the only thing I
within
can
the
say about that, and it's a good point, is that so classic experiments when replicated on Turk, you basically get the same results. Turk, what we're trying to do here is kind of have an average and randomly assign them. So differences in endowments among Turk people should be randomly assigned into different categories, into different conditions. I think one thing that we see, which is surprising given the extra cognition required, is look at the rates of innovation and how high they actually are, right? So people enjoy innovation. They actually weirdly enjoy it even more in our math-related tasks than in our word-related tasks. I wouldn't have expected that. But they seem to enjoy it. So the cognitive effort part of it, it's possible. I don't have anything that suggests in the data that suggests that that's what's going on.
Yeah, my question was kind of similar, which is that I think maybe you do have something in the data that
Okay.
suggests that, which is that people are looking at it and saying, how hard is this going to be? And if they think it's going to be hard, that means more effort. So they're could be doing a cost-benefit analysis that reflects how hard they think it's going to be. And they also could be right?
Right.
It could be that the smarter people are the ones who are doing the innovating or more math, whatever, like more skill at math. Like I would wonder what would happen if you gave the problem to a bunch of computer scientists,
Yeah,
for example.
we do too, and I bet it would be different.
And they love to do this kind of stuff, right?
Exactly, they have a taste for it.
So-
But what's odd is like regular people seem to, in the Wagging Task, really like innovating in this space as well. Very high rates of innovation, even in the conditions where innovation doesn't make sense economically. So the idea that the smart and the not so smart are sorting themselves, it's possible, but
Or the confident and the not so confident. I mean, it could be
right.
either way.
Right, but a lot of people are engaging in behavior that's suboptimal given the structure of the problem. So they're not sorting themselves.
But how do you know
nearly
suboptimal when you don't know what the cost is for them? That seems to
Yeah,
be
what's the
like-
value of intrinsic motivation in generating your
Yeah.
predictions for expected innovate or borrow decisions? That's the
Yeah, so that complicating model you have is that there's an internal cost of cognition. They're discounting their return by that internal cost. Yeah, we can't rule that out. That's a good point. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.